So Nadia, it's Philardis with a P. Hi Nadia, nice to meet you. Hi Mahmoud, nice to see you both. I'm just glad to be with you, and that's one of the good things about filmmaking and academia is that this is possible, that we can talk across distances and all kinds of other obstacles, and how great that is, what a good thing that is. And I'm glad to be part of that at this moment and thinking with you and talking with you. And I don't know, I feel it's like one of the, given all the kind of obstacles to everything at this moment and in every way, I feel grateful about many things. And one of them is this kind of interaction where we can be thinking about something. I'm appreciate being invited, and I'm glad to be here. So it's just, I just think it's worth noticing that possibility and taking advantage of it. Even in my classes, it's been possible to bring in multiples of visitors, all kinds of filmmakers, just for an hour, people can just show up from any part of the world in a way that you couldn't come into a classroom. I mean, you could always have done it before, and I have done it before, using phones and screens and whatever, but it wasn't naturalized in the way that it is. Like last night, there was an event where the students created an event online in our department in which the seniors spoke to people coming into the department and people in the department, students, totally student run and student designed, in which the seniors talked to them about how they moved through their coursework, how they came into the department, how they moved through the coursework, what are the opportunities, what were the dead ends, what things worked. And that's a pandemic related, that's a Zoom pandemic related thing that just would not have occurred in any other way. I mean, the movie theaters were emptied out and then people are having a hard time going back. It certainly has accelerated an existing trend in which films were being seen in places other than movie theaters. And while this is personally a loss for me, that I still believe in that collective experience, there's no stopping the technology in the way of the world and, screens and things being handheld and all that. And so it didn't make it happen, but it's accelerated that process here. And I don't know where that's going to end up. I mean, this is all part of our new reality that we're still learning how to do. I mean, and politically in the United States, I think that former President Trump would have been reelected without the pandemic. Without that, and it was really close anyway. And so, from my own point of view, that's one of the upsides of the moment. It's just my own political view. Other people may think otherwise, but it's just had a profound effect on everything. There isn't a single thing in our lives that hasn't been affected by the pandemic, and then our relationship to it. And some things are positive. I mean, and many things are negative, and also the numbers of people dying. And it's also contributed to political instability, that everything moving online, and then there's been such direct communication through the internet that every groups that were once marginal are now more central. So it's been partly activating democracy and partly activating what I think of as anti-democratic forces as well. I'm a filmmaker. I'm not a scholar. I'm a filmmaker. And I came into the academy as a filmmaker, and my filmmaking was my scholarship. And I think that the fact that it was appreciated as such is what makes everything else possible. And then in a way, the question is, what is the relationship of filmmaking to academia or art making to academia? They're often thought of as separate things, but I think there's, at least in the United States and many liberal arts institutions, and partly driven by student interest, partly by the changes in the world, even the way we started this conversation thinking about how people see movies and how all that is, there's a shift. And there's a way in which, art making and filmmaking are different ways of knowing the world. And if academia and scholarship is about knowing the world through our disciplines, then why shouldn't art or filmmaking be part of that thinking, part of that interrogation of the world? That you see the world, if you're a filmmaker or an artist, you see the world in a certain way that is rigorous, historical, theoretical, as well as expressive. It's the expressive piece that in a way distinguishes much scholarship. I mean, lots of scholarship is also expressive, but expressivity is like an integral part of art making and filmmaking. And I think that the way of the world is that making things embodied in the author as a artist, as a filmmaker, is a way of knowing the world not unlike any other ways of knowing the world. And if the Academy thinks that, then people like me, perhaps like you, Mahmoud, as well, that your film work would be a valued piece, not an extracurricular piece. It has to be at the same level. It has to be thought of at the same level, and that things like tenure, promotion would be a part of it. Now, it can be part, I'm a filmmaker, but a lot of the people I teach are also scholars. I mean, young scholars, graduate students who are studying something, but also making things. And that making things at the same time that you're doing your scholarship makes for this powerful, in my view, scholar practitioner, which I think is the future. And I think it's the future of liberal arts, that without that piece, that liberal arts education will be cut off from our ability to attract students, our ability to know what the world is like as we become ever more connected in these different kinds of ways. And art making and filmmaking is central to our way of understanding what the world is like. So in a way, the shift, I think, needs to be in the Academy. And then in that shift, people like us can make the work that we think is also important. And that we're training people in that way. Those people in our PhD program, say in art, film, and visual studies, it's called Film and Visual Studies in the graduate program in our department. Many filmmakers are coming through the Academy in this twin way, and that their scholarship and their filmmaking or art making is a part of what makes them employable once they graduate. And we're seeing many, many examples of universities all around our country and in the world where such people have an advantage, not a disadvantage. I would say 20 years ago, if you wanted to do both, it was a disadvantage. But I think now there's a growing understanding that that's the future, and in a way, the present, which of course is the topic of my films. But I also think I just think it's something to think about and to argue for. And I think that it's the future of liberal arts education. Making films about people, nonfiction films about people, is excruciatingly complicated. In a film like The Same River Twice, it's like about 80 minutes long. I think that intense reduction of somebody's life to 12 minutes and to make the claim that those 12 minutes can express something serious about anybody's life is monstrous. I mean, it's really just unbelievable, let alone the kinds of exposures, like showing people naked when they're young, and putting that in front of other people, let alone being there for very personal things, and that I'm seeing those personal things because we're friends and they're letting me see it because I'm their friend. This is a complicated thing, an ethical thing, but it's also the nature of filmmaking and art. And I think for me, the ethics of that are, it's funny, just to answer the question as asked, that one of the things that I think for me works for The Same River Twice is that the characters inhabit their current lives pretty fully. They're not really living in the past. They're really living in the present. They're kind of shocked and amused by seeing themselves in the past. I mean, when Danny at the beginning, the woman who's the aerobics instructor, is like looking at an image of herself and she kind of laughs, and I ask, why is she laughing? And she goes, my breast, I recognize it, from 20 years ago. And there's something so sweet about that, and so telling and so direct. It does a couple of things. It makes it possible to look at people's naked bodies because a person in the film has acknowledged that they are naked. It's not just a thought you have, it's a thought that the people in the film have, and they've sort of saying it's okay, even if slightly embarrassing. But slightly embarrassing is not an ethical violation. It's just slightly embarrassing. And that seemed okay. And that's at the front of the film precisely to allow people to watch and not feel, uncomfortable. Like, why, are we sure we have the permission of everybody? Is it really okay? These are real questions, and that has to be dispensed with quickly. And I think Danny's like just she's abashed. She thinks it's funny. She's laughing. She's a little red-faced, but that's all, that seems to me. And that's like a real response. And so the ethical pieces, there's many things that I filmed that aren't in the film because I thought they went too far. If the mechanism for the film is our friendship, I mean, the film is drenched in our friendships. It's not, I don't have a voiceover. I don't appear in the film as a character, but the ways in which they respond to me shooting, the ways in which the camera is embodied, that their friendliness towards the filmmaking process and their authenticity, I think gives a kind of permission to film. But I'm aware that that permission is contingent. It doesn't have endless, it doesn't mean I can film everything or put everything in the movie. And I don't. There's things I don't include that seem to take that permission too far, so that our relationships is in a way the medium of the movie. It's the medium in which the story is being told, which is different than meeting people for the first time in a movie and getting their permission. There's something like a lifetime of experience. I mean, I knew Danny, when I was 12 years old. I knew Jeff since I was 10 years old. Barry since I was 15 years old. And the newcomers to my life I've known for 45 years. So there's something about that knowing that allows such a story to be told in a way that I hope is ethically responsible and intimate, both. I think being young is incredibly beautiful and also can be incredibly difficult. It's easy to make it just sort of hazy and wonderful. And that's a kind of nostalgia that I think, if that was in the film, would kind of kill the film. It's not to say that how beautiful are they? I mean, it's just extraordinary. And it's not just them, it's just being young. I mean, it's like, and in a way, if they weren't naked, if they were just on a river trip, a camping trip, it would just seem, but there's something about their bodies before time has taken them into their middle age, and then in my new film, beyond middle age, that just kind of shouts being young. It shouts youth. It shouts a kind of authenticity of being young in a way that you can't claim. If you just talk about being young, it's one thing, but if you see it, it's like, and it stakes out, it creates a kind of mythic, in my view, a kind of mythical, potentially mythical quality that on that river trip, it's before they've taken a bite of the apple of their middle age, of their adulthood, not even middle age, adulthood, that they have yet to make the decisions that will define them as adults. And in a way, that's what being in the garden was. It was like a lack of knowing, a kind of innocence about what the world was. And there's something about what that looks like, what the garden looks like in a certain kind of way, and then juxtaposing that against what, the complexities of the way things turned out. They're no longer young, they're middle-aged, they have all the problems of health and family and relationships and all of that, their place in the world, and all of those questions. They're now living with those questions, and that's in a way the topic of the film is, what are those questions? What are they living with? And if it wasn't juxtaposed against this sort of gaudy representation of being young, I don't think there would be any real poignancy to those choices, because those choices are simply ordinary. But the frame of time passing allows us to know them as having been once young and transitioned into this new life. And then going back and forth in time suggests that they're embedded in time. In a way that characters in nonfiction, you're always filming in the present in nonfiction film, or you have archival material. In this case, the archival material is something not quite from the archive. It's like from their lives and my life with them. And in a way, it takes it out of the archival. It's not distanced, it's personal. So seeing them then and now suggests that they live in time and that their middle-age choices are, weren't secure. They were contingent. They happened the way that they happened through their life choices, and the film films them embedded. And then the other thing about that is that it was filmed over 4 years, because there had to be velocity in the present. The present had to have an ongoing present that generated its own past. So every time you cut back to a character, you were further down the road with them. And that takes time in nonfiction for things to happen. Barry's running for office. He loses. He gets cancer. He turns 50. Those markers are shot over 4 years. And while it collapses it and it doesn't seem like so much time has passed, in my view, I needed that time in the present to create a present that was moving forward rather than just being embedded in the present, which documentaries are often embedded in the now, often in really good ways. That's really good. But then here, the frame of the film is time itself passing by going back to when they were in their 20s and as they're heading towards 50. Also, I'm slow. And this is related to being, having a full-time job in the academy, is that it slows me down because I have a full-time job. I'm working all the time. Not all the time. I have summers, I have sabbaticals. I'm able to, if I've got momentum on a film, then I can be working part of the days. I can organize my time to keep a project going. Very hard for me to start a project. I can keep making a movie and teach if I've got momentum heading into a semester. I would say, and it's a personal answer, I don't know how how much it can be generalized, but for myself, I would say for the first, I don't know, dozen years of my teaching, I thought of my teaching and my filmmaking as deeply related but parallel. And I moved back and forth between them. It was hard. I mean, there was a way in which one always was taking, one always was in some way taking time away from the other, even as each gave to the other. But I had a complicated relationship between that. And at some point, somewhere, after that, so in the last 15 or 20 years, my filmmaking, my teaching, my engagement with the world of film, which has increased more and more over time, where I'm asked to look at films or speak or whatever it is, my connection to all of that began to seem like one thing, that this was my practice. My practice included filmmaking, teaching, being in the world of filmmaking, being in the world of academia. The speed of all of that was a function of all the things that I did. And I stopped being the least bit regretful. It was just what I did. It was my work. It's my practice. That's how I organize it. And it seemed unnecessary to think of them as competing. Why not think of them as allied? And I now think that, I feel that, I don't feel that tension. I just, it all means I have to live long enough to get my filmmaking done, to have as many, enough films and enough ideas out there to continue. So I have to have the luck of longevity to make all of that work in the long run. But even in the short run, it's a decision I made a long time ago that I'm happy to live with. Wasn't always true, Mahmoud, so I appreciate the question, but for me, this is where I've ended up.
You nicely summed up the dilemma of a lifetime.
And it is a dilemma of a lifetime. How do you live your life? I mean, how does one live their life? How does one live a life that you believe in, that you care about, that's consistent with your values, that exercises your energies and intelligence, and that's adding something to the world, hopefully, rather than taking away from it. These are huge questions, and in some ways, a film like River Dogs was trying to approach that question in my 20s. This is how we were responding to those questions in our 20s, in this kind of strange and but in a way it grew out of the 60s. It was like, how do you live a life that's, environmentally, socially communal, environmentally sound, not so invested in money, connected to your community, all of these kinds of questions. And that's what it looked like. I mean, that's what I was filming in a certain way. I thought it would be more political, as I was filming it. Actually, when I was making River Dogs in my 20s, I thought that material would seem political, but it never did. It just shouted being young. And as time passed, ever more shouted being young and not exactly politics. Although now, in a way, given people's lives now, and that what I'm filming now is so I'm making a third film. I've been filming for 3 years. I probably have another year of filming. There were 2 mayors in Same River Twice. 2 people became mayors, and another character had been highly involved in their local politics in his 30s. And that person, Jeff, ran to be a state senator in Southern Oregon. At 68, he ran, he got married at 67. At 68, he ran for office. And at 69, he won. And that he became a state senator, during these turbulent times. And so now he's doing the thing that his whole life he's wanted to do, which is to serve at that level. It was a kind of both personal belief and a kind of just personal ambition. Interestingly for Jeff, he was somebody who went to Harvard as an undergraduate, like he was like the smartest kid in his class. He entered Harvard as a sophomore. He got straight A's when he was at Harvard. And after 2 years, he dropped out because he didn't want to be trained in society. This was 1970, and he didn't want to be an elite in a society he didn't really trust, that the war in Vietnam was raging and our civil rights situation was really bad. There were so many things wrong. There was so much division in the society. And he dropped out of college and he became a carpenter. And then he's just slowly sort of returned to whatever his aspirations were as a young man, not having dropped out of Harvard as a 20-year-old. And as a 70-year-old now, today, he's returned to his ambition to be a state senator, which is what he's doing. So I shot River Dogs in 1978. I'm 28 years old. It's like really like, in a way, it's my very first film. It was insane to do, 35 days outdoors, filming on a river. I had solar battery chargers, and it was just like kind of a mess. And I was inexperienced, like very inexperienced, but I was so in love with the cinema and the idea of making images and hearing the sound of the film go by my head and holding the camera on my shoulder and keeping everything safe and all of it, and then trying to see what this world looked like. And I have a light meter. It's completely different. I mean, how film renders light, how film as film renders light. And I'm shooting reversal, which was probably a mistake, but I didn't really trust negative film at that point. So I'm changing magazines all the time because it has different speeds. And the film that I loved was very, very slow, and this was a fall trip, so the shadows would get too deep, and it meant I had to change mags to shoot with a higher speed film, and they render light very differently, the stocks I was using. But it has all the qualities of somebody in love with cinema. For me, it's like I just was so young, and and also just I felt like if I could just see really well with the camera, that would reveal something of the world. This was my guiding principle, that no voiceover, no music track, just the ability to see and hear the sounds of the river and the sounds of that place and film it as closely as I could. And then the problem of filming people naked. It's like, how do you film people naked in a way that's respectful? It's already complicated, but how do you do that? And so I thought about that a lot as I was filming, from whatever angles I was at and what the light was like, and how to make sense of the bodies as a shooter, as a filmmaker. And when I started filming the Same River Twice, I was using a little standard def camera, a VX1000, a Sony VX1000. It's a little dinky camera, one of the early 90s, highly portable. This was one of the ones that I just sort of picked up. And I was aware it actually kept me up at night, was like, I hoped that the juxtaposition between the then and the now would be housed in the materiality of the film itself, or the medium itself that I was using, and that the then would look like something and the now would look like something, and that difference meant something rather than just that looked nice and now it looks crummy. You know, that it could, that meaning like leak into the meaning of the film, or would it just stand apart as a problem? And I didn't know. I mean, you never don't know as a filmmaker. You try these things, and until you try them, you don't know how it's going to play. And hearing you say that, it's like exactly what I would hope. That the other part was exactly also that it would make the past seem too dreamy and beautiful, and make the present seem too dreary and ordinary. And it does in a way, and that's true in a way. But and also, you know, the filming them in the present, which is now 20 years ago, it's kind of rushed and talky and not beautiful. It's not, the meaning isn't embedded into the materiality of the meaning. In a way, the video itself is effaced, and then they come forward a little bit as characters and what they have to say and our friendships, and make the present seem, I think, more alive, less regarded, as there was a slight distance in shooting River Dogs. And that's replaced by the nature of our friendships and our love for each other over so many years.
Maybe we should credit the editor to some extent too.
Oh yeah.
Was the editor helpful in the process?
Oh my God. I'd always edited my own films until this one. I've always directed, produced, shot, and edited, and taken sound mostly for all the films that I've made. I like having tactile connection to the filmmaking process, and it's where authorship grows. You know, and for me, I didn't know how to make a film with an editor. I mean, I feared it. And then I had this, you know, I had this idea that having somebody edit my film was like paying somebody to make love to my wife. That's how I imagined it. Seemed like a really bad idea. But then I didn't have time to do it myself. You know, I was teaching full time. It's like I would try to do it. And for the first 2 years of shooting, I cut, but I was unable to kind of address the material. And there was a local editor, Karen Schmier, who was just a fantastic person and a fantastic editor, and hadn't edited anything quite like this. And she was near the beginning of her career. But it took me so long to make the film that we both grew together in the making of the film. She was hugely important in making the film. This was a collaboration, deep collaboration, that I owe her a huge debt. While I was making the film and raising money and still shooting over these 4 years, she would take other jobs. She cut Errol Morris's Fog of War during the time that she was working with me. And she cut some other films at the same time. She's quite amazing. Karen, sorry.
Oh.
No, Karen was killed in a car accident.
Oh my God.
You know, something like 10 years ago. And I still miss her, and she was amazing.
May she rest in peace. I didn't really know that. I wouldn't have brought that up.
No, it's fine to bring up, and I can't stop myself from crying, but it's not like that's a problem. I mean, she was an amazing human being, an amazing person. And then there's been lots of editing awards in the United States given in her name, the Karen Schmier Fellowship, and it's like her friends have really rallied for her. She was like a month shy of turning 40. And she was in her late 20s when we worked together. And I'd always wanted her to edit the next one. We joked about it. What are you doing in 20 years? And, we talked about it. So that's a sadness for me that can't be the case. It would be so wonderful to have her. But there are other wonderful editors. And life is the way it turns out, and mortality is a big part of it, and of course a big part of what the third film will be.
How about the technical plan for the third film? Because as I mentioned, the film style really contributed to the first part, and the videos contributed to the second part. And now we have all these crazy 4K technology and all the different equipments. In what way are you trying? Will you connect that technology with the theme of the film?
Right, exactly. And of course, it's just like I was 20 years ago. I'm just guessing that, I have hopes for how that will work and what I'm hoping for. So I've been shooting mostly in HD, partly not 4K. I find 4K like so specific, every pore, in a way kind of inhuman. Whereas there's something slightly smeary about HD, which I like. Also, since I'm doing all of the shooting, I'm doing everything myself. When I go on a shoot, it's just me. There's nobody else. So I'm shooting, I'm downloading, I'm wrangling footage, I'm producing, I'm directing, I'm doing everything. And 4K just takes a lot more time to ingest into the computer. And since I don't have anybody else doing it, it made more sense for me to keep shooting in HD. So HD is still radically different than standard def, which is the second film, and radically different than 16 millimeter, which is the first film. And I'm shooting in 16:9 or 178. So the first film's in 16, which is 133. Standard def that I was shooting was also 133. So the 133 will be embedded in a 16:9 or 178 frame. So they'll be moving back and forth between aspect ratios, as well as the kind of between the resolution and color saturation and chroma and all that of HD as distinct from standard def. It looks different. The weird thing is cutting them all together, which I've been trying to do, isn't as distinct as I would imagine. In a way, the move between being 16 millimeter and being young and naked is a much more dramatic move to being clothed and middle-aged than being elderly or on their way to being elderly or whatever it is that we are, and being, in your 40s. It's not like, it's not like you can't tell, but there isn't that instant recognition, even with the different aspect ratio of how the present and the past interacts as a visual trope. So I don't know, there may be other ways to augment that. It may be that it's not necessary, and keep looking at this space, and we'll see what happens. I agree that art has access to human experience in complex ways that are hard to reduce, yet completely present. And also, if those works are designed to do what you just said, I think that won't work. I mean, they don't make sense if they're like an argument, an orderly argument that leads to something. They have to be somehow synthetic and holistic about what they are, and then what they are can begin to approach those questions. It's a kind of indirectness that has much more direct power into people, and it's, one of the complex things is students often think that they have a complicated feeling about work at the end, and they think that making work leads to that. So how do you make something that produces that experience? And then it becomes too direct a line and too literal somehow. And then it really is this complicated thing of making sense of the work you're doing in the deepest way you can within the medium that you're doing, with no sense of what it's adding up to at that level, at the level that you're talking about. But once you do that, if you can possibly succeed at that, then I think it can translate in the ways that you're describing, in a way that I think is quite beautifully said. And one of the complexities of including it in the academy, because it there's a slight mismatch between those two things, between, a scholarly argument and a artistic work can get to very similar things, but they can't by doing it the same way. They have to do it in their own way. And then you have to believe in the own way for that to be the case. So I appreciate your thoughts about that, and also connecting it to Iranian philosophy and history. I know Stanley Cavell. I don't know if you know Stanley Cavell. He's a philosopher. He was a philosopher at Harvard for many years, and our department was created partly through him because he believed that film could be what you just described. And he was like a fantastic supporter, and also somebody, he started playing saxophone. I mean, as a young man, he was a saxophone player. He came to philosophy kind of late, and showing him your work, if you were lucky enough to kind of ask him to come see a work in progress on the editing table, and sitting with him and showing him my work, and just the things he would say, it was so fantastic and so inspiring. He loved film. He loved film, and he loved thinking about film in the same way that he loved thinking about Walden Pond, or romantic comedies from the 40s. He just had such an active imagination and mind, and I think philosophy can be that. It's another way in which philosophy can keep hold of the present, and make that alive for people in the ways that I think you just described. I'm appreciative.
As I understand from your words, maybe we could say that film and art naturally does that.
It can, yes, it can. It ought to. It can, if it's not designed to do that. If it's designed to be itself, it can do that. Yes.
Like the Same River Twice. I mean, one of the notes that I wrote was that characters become sort of existentialist philosophers. I mean, when one of them is seeing images of her youth, you ask her, why did we do that? And she says, because we could.
Danny. Yes.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And
she goes on to say, it's not in the movie. I don't think it's in the movie. I remember this as being a conversation with Karen. It's like I asked her that, why did we do that? And she said, she goes, because we could. And then she thinks about it again, and she says it less convincingly, because we could. And then she goes, I don't know. It just seemed to, this was about being naked. And she said it just seemed to go with being outdoors and being wet. And then she kind of devolves into not knowing. But her first answer, she says in a kind of defiant way.
yes.
And which I loved, and the truth in nonfiction could have stopped in any one of those answers, whether you included part B, part C, part D, and it would have meant something different at each part. And I think we get out at part A, although it was something we talked about a lot. Documentary is complicated that way because it's a constructed nonfiction, which is different than fiction, but not the same as actuality.
Or one of the male characters, when he views the voting session, whether we should end the trip or we should go on, and now he's a middle-aged man, he says, I changed my vote.
I know. He goes, I changed my vote. Is it too late?
Yeah.
And then he says, next time, it's not in the movie actually, but again, he goes on to say, next I see Jim, I'm going to change my vote. And next time I see Kathy, I'm going to apologize.
Great. So how about your more recent productions and your cooperation with Peter? Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. This is another one of these great pleasures of teaching in a university. I mean, it's just like, in a way, what a pleasure, what a wonderful thing. And this version of that is that in 2000, Um, while I'm in the midst of shooting and editing The Same River Twice, Peter um, comes to our department looking for somebody to teach a class with about film and science. And he ends up talking to me. And I'd always been really interested in film and science. And I had made some science films just because I was interested early on. Um, and um, and we started to teach this course every other year since 2000 called Filming Science. And it was a kind of hybrid course in which there were 10 students. There were a mix of graduates and undergraduates, of historians of science and filmmakers, and even, neurobiologists and other people in the sciences. And the question in the class was, what happens to film when science is its topic? And what happens to science when it's filmed? What is the relationship of these two things? What is the relationship of these different ways of knowing when you put them together? And you have each interrogate the other, and that became the kind of rolling understanding. And people made films in scientific environments, broadly construed. Sometimes it's laboratories, sometimes it was in recycling centers, and other ways in which science was handled in different kinds of vernacular ways, as well as hard science in laboratories. Things like, fluid mechanics, or, all kinds of things. And this was incredibly fun. I mean, this was such a fun and dynamic. I learned a lot by co-teaching. It's a lot more work to co-teach than to teach on your own. It's like, it's not half the work, it's twice the work, because you have to say everything out loud. And there were many things that would happen in a classroom, like, if you share a classroom with somebody, how do you know who to call on? How do you share calling on people? How do you share where their conversation goes? What do you think of as the most important thing that's happening? How do you notice the little micro moments of somebody's discomfort, or somebody's unusually silent, or somebody needs to stay silent, or they need to be called on? These are like complicated, and these kind of micro assessments happen in classrooms, especially seminar style classrooms, all the time. And to share that in a way that you can't talk over, you can't decide ahead of time. So it turned out that Peter and I could share a classroom in those ways, that our intuitions about teaching and learning were very much aligned, and our curiosity about things was very much aligned. Now, Peter had always loved film, and he'd made a film before he met me, but Peter's extraordinary. He has 2 PhDs, one in history of science, and while he was getting his history of science PhD, he got a second PhD in theoretical physics, because he didn't want to be a historian of science without being a physicist. He wanted to be able to know a field as well as study the field. And he's a MacArthur Fellow. I mean, he's just amazing guy. He's a university professor at Harvard. It's like, what a guy. He's just a wonderful person, incredibly smart, speaks in simple, straightforward language about very complicated things. He's never obscure. His clarity of mind can reduce even the most complicated topics to kind of a way of talking about things. We would be in the car driving for hundreds of miles together to do a mix for a film that we made. And he would describe to me the way that, your phone keeping track of where you are was connected to Einstein's, second theory of, it was like, and just give me the sort of history and the technology and how it all works. Of course, I understood about 20%, but better than no percent. And I would say over this time, he became a filmmaker, but I did not become a historian of science. But I became a lot more familiar with the ideas, and had the great pleasure of working together with him. And over some time, over some years, we thought, well, our ability to successfully negotiate a classroom together and thinking together like that, maybe we should make a film together. And that film became Secrecy. And Secrecy was chosen in part because of its, in a way, it's like, my feeling was, if I'm going to make a film with somebody else, I don't want to make a film like I would ordinarily make and just with somebody else. I want to make something quite different. I want to see what that's like. I want to really collaborate. And in our collaboration, this idea of how do you know things if the government's keeping things from you? How does a democracy work? What's the relationship of government secrecy to national security and democracy? How do these things work? And a really complicated idea to explore, because it violates one of the basic tenets I have about what good filmmaking is, or the first question in filmmaking for me is, what do you point the camera at? Somebody will have an idea and I'll say, what will we see? What do you imagine we will see? And in secrecy, the answer is nothing. The whole secrecy system is redacted. It's like it's held from view. You can't look at it. So how do you make sense of something you can't look at in cinema? And we took that on as a problem. Like, well, let's just see what happens. That's a terrible idea in a way. I don't recommend it because it works so against what cinema can do. Yet I sort of loved the idea of the challenge of how do you make such a thing. And also historically, this took place just as the war in Iraq was starting, and there was a real absence of news. The New York Times really abdicated their responsibility, I think, and that American journalism abdicated their responsibility in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks and the beginning of the Iraq War in like, well, why are we doing this? What is the evidence for doing this? Why are we as a nation doing this extraordinarily complicated thing? And what is the ideology of that? And how to, in a way, it's a precursor to this moment, is how do facts interrogate the present as distinct from ideology, for example. And the film wants to think about how governments have used in the United States secrecy over the course of time, and especially coming into our current moment, its relationship to nuclear power and nuclear secrets, and then the current moment that we were in at that point. But it also was before a lot of the secrecy revelations of WikiLeaks and all of that. This was before that, so it anticipated that. And we used animation to try to represent this world you can't see, but about. You can infer it. You don't see gravity, but you can experience gravity, and that the animation was a way to create a gravitational field in the imagery, and music, and then certain kinds of stories, and also using people from all sides of the political spectrum to think about those things. It premiered at Sundance, and it was used by the American Civil Liberties Union, this sort of First Amendment rights organization in the United States, to think about government secrecy and to show to its members and to surface that question. It's a really fundamental question, how much the government owes to tell you, and the limits of that. Like, where is the limits of that? When is it too dangerous to say things? And of course, that also exists. It's not only one way, but the whole system itself was shrouded in secrecy. So, like, exposing the secrecy system, not the secrets themselves, but how it all works, was the task of the movie. I'm suspicious of movies that you have to show your credentials to enter. Like, you have to say you already believe in the film's conclusions to enter the movie. I mean this, metaphorically, but there's lots of films in which, and there's nothing exactly wrong with it. Sometimes different sides need that kind of support to know more and to sturdy up your ideas and to fight for what you believe in, but for me, it's less interesting to make a film in which the conclusion is known from the beginning. I'd rather explore. I think by the end of the film, I think it leans towards more openness than more closedness, but it acknowledges the complexity of the idea and that there are sometimes reasons to hold things from a population. Democracy doesn't work if it's not grounded in an open flow of information. It just doesn't work in the same way. I mean, and we're experiencing that in our country right now, in the United States, this ability for the internet to pick and choose between what's factual and what's not, and what people believe and what they don't. This glut of information, in a way, this unfiltered glut of information is promoting the balkanization of beliefs in our country and making democracy very difficult right now.
Do you want to mention any notes about the Iranian cinema?
I was thinking about this because especially the second new wave. I'm not an expert in Iranian cinema, but I've loved Iranian cinema and very moved by Kiarostami and Makhmalbaf and many others. It's like, it's a kind of cause of celebration when new films come out from Iran, that my friends and I, that the people I know and the people who love cinema. And also I'll say one other thing about this, that at Harvard, there's every other year, there's a thing called the Norton Lectures, and poetry is, but it's about poetry broadly construed, maybe in a way that Iranians would understand more than most. But, it's like T.S. Eliot or Leonard Bernstein or Toni Morrison, the writer. And we were thinking about a filmmaker for the first time. And the only filmmaker in the world that our committee thought could be somebody at the highest levels of cinema who could speak for contemporary cinema in a way that could hold 6 lectures. It's 6 lectures. It's a lot of time, and filmmakers aren't necessarily the best at lecturing. The only person that we all agreed upon was Kiarostami, just before he died. And so just to say that there's some way in which the poetry of the image, the kinds of stories, the ways in which they're told, sometimes the fluidity between nonfiction and fiction, a kind of freedom within a lot of discipline, which is like the best kind of art in a way, the best kind of cinema. I've just been moved by it. So I'm speaking less as a scholar than as a kind of devoted fan. But as a devoted fan, it's been an important part of my life, an important part of my cinematic growth. It is hard, of course. It's also you'd have to really look at what the program is, because it's not a film studies program. It's more what the scholars in my department call media archaeology. And it mixes all kinds of visual art forms and sometimes sonic art forms as well, and explores them in all kinds of ways. And that people are sometimes practitioners come into the program with masters of fine arts in filmmaking or in art making, and then join the PhD in scholarly PhD and continue their art making and continue there. But it isn't impossible. And you should get on the website. It's Department of Art, Film and Visual Studies at Harvard University. And the program itself is called Film and Visual Studies, which is the graduate program. If you got in touch with me, I could put you in touch with the people who run that program, the directors of graduate studies and like that, which I'm happy to do. And with any of you, I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to forward how to do that if that interests you. It's highly sought after. It's difficult to get in, but doesn't mean it can't be gotten in, and people do.
I think it was a great session for all the participants, and I hate that I need to wrap it up because I enjoyed it a lot. And I would like to hear the last word from you.
So I'm sorry not to get more questions. I'm sorry that I spoke so much. I just ate up a lot of time with talking, but really nice to be here. Really nice to be amongst you and to think with you and to mean something to me personally. I appreciate that, as well as professionally and intellectually. And perhaps when I finish the 3rd film in the next couple of years, I can send that to you, and then we can do this again and talk about, river and shore, which is what I'm calling it, or, there's lots of other kinds of joke names that I won't go through now, but I'm just to say that I'm very, very appreciative to be here, and I would be happy to come back, and I'm sure we'll connect another way.
It would be great to have a similar session in the near future. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rob. Thank you so much, Nadia, for allowing us to have this session. And
let me thank you, Mahmoud, and you, Nadia, also for the invitation and for organizing all this and doing all this work. It doesn't just happen. I know it doesn't just happen, and I appreciate all that, and as well as the invitation.